We thought the cabin was empty. Until we opened the trunk. It started like any other weekend. I had just gotten back from work on a Friday evening, exhausted, and ready to collapse in front of the TV. My best friend, Jake, called me right as I stepped through the door. He sounded unusually excited. "Man, you're not going to believe this," Jake said, practically shouting into the phone. "Remember that old cabin my family used to rent in the summers? Yeah, the one by the lake." I kicked off my shoes and collapsed on the couch. "What about it?" "Well, it's up for sale now. Apparently, the owners haven't used it in years. They're just looking to get rid of it. And get this, it's dirt cheap. I thought we could head up there for the weekend, check it out, reminisce a little. It'll be fun." I hesitated for a moment. I hadn't been up to that cabin in years, not since high school. Something about that place always gave me a weird vibe, but I brushed it off, figuring it was just childhood memories playing tricks on me. "All right," I agreed, still not sure. I could use a weekend away. The drive out to the cabin was a long one. Jake and I hadn't been close in recent years, life had pulled us in different directions, but our bond was still strong enough to make spontaneous trips like this happen. We loaded up the car with beer, snacks, and just enough nostalgia to make the long drive bearable. As we pulled off the main road and onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, the familiar landscape of dense trees and overgrown fields brought back flashes of summers spent fishing, hiking, and occasionally sneaking into the woods at night to tell ghost stories. The road got rougher the deeper we drove, and soon the cabin came into view. It looked different. Older. More worn than I remembered. The wooden slats of the cabin's exterior were weather-beaten, some of them peeling away from years of neglect. The windows were clouded with grime, and the front porch, once the centerpiece of countless barbecues, was sagging slightly. There was an unsettling stillness around the place, like time had forgotten it. We parked the car, grabbed our bags, and headed inside. The interior wasn't much better. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Jake didn't seem to care, he was grinning ear to ear, ready to explore. "Just like old times, huh?" he said, slapping me on the back. "Yeah," I muttered, but I wasn't so sure. The first night was uneventful. We drank, talked about old memories, and tried to convince ourselves that we were still the same adventurous kids we used to be. But there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. The cabin felt off. Even though we hadn't been there in years, it was like it didn't want us there. That night, I slept fitfully. I woke up several times, convinced I heard something moving outside. The trees were thick around the cabin, but every now and then, I thought I saw shadows shifting between them. I told myself it was the beer playing tricks on me. The next morning, Jake was already up, eager to explore the lake. The water was just as still as I remembered it, though the dock was half-rotted, and the boats that used to be tied to it were long gone. We hiked for a bit, but there was this creeping sense of isolation that started to gnaw at me. The more time we spent outside, the more I realized how far away we were from everything. No cell service, no nearby neighbors, just us and the woods. By the time the sun began to set, I was feeling uneasy. Something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the isolation, it was the cabin itself. Like it was watching us. Jake, of course, was oblivious to it. He was having the time of his life, reliving his teenage years like nothing had changed. That evening, as we sat by the fire pit behind the cabin, roasting marshmallows like we used to, Jake brought up something I'd almost forgotten. "Hey, do you remember that summer when we heard those noises in the woods?" I paused, the memory surfacing like a cold hand reaching out from the past. "Yeah, I remember. We thought it was some animal or something." Jake shook his head, grinning. "Nah, man. That was no animal. We never figured out what it was, but it freaked me out for days. I think there's something weird about this place. His words hung in the air between us, and for the first time, I saw something like doubt flicker in his eyes. He was joking, but there was a kernel of truth in his voice. As the night wore on, that familiar sense of unease grew. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded too much like whispers. The fire dimmed, casting long shadows across the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We turned in for the night, but I couldn't sleep. Hours passed, and I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from outside. I froze, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, almost like someone knocking on the walls. I shot up, listening harder. Jake was still snoring in the other room, oblivious. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the window. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I scanned the tree-line, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something, or someone, was standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, shadowy figure. It stood perfectly still, watching the cabin. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no way I was imagining this. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, cold and unyielding, like it was waiting for something. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, but the batteries were dead. In a panic, I shook Jake awake. "What's going on?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "There's someone outside," I whispered. "I saw them." Jake sat up, looking confused. "What? That's ridiculous. There's nobody out here." But when he saw the look on my face, he got up and followed me to the window. We both looked out, but the figure was gone. "I swear, Jake, there was someone there," I insisted. He frowned, but before he could respond, we heard it, tapping. But this time, it was coming from inside the cabin. Both of us froze, staring at each other in disbelief. The sound was faint at first, like knuckles gently rapping against wood, but it was growing louder. It was coming from the attic. Jake grabbed a bat he had brought along for protection, and we slowly made our way to the attic stairs. The air up there was thick and musty, and the wooden steps creaked under our weight. With each step, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. We reached the top, and Jake pushed open the door. The attic was pitch black, the only light coming from. We were plunged into complete darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping, louder now, echoing from deep within the attic. Jake flashed his phone's light around, but the weak beam only illuminated dusty boxes and old furniture draped in cobwebs. "There's no one here," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was still, eerily silent. I almost thought it was over. Then, suddenly, the tapping resumed, closer this time. It was coming from one of the large, old trunks in the far corner of the attic. Jake and I exchanged a glance, dread crawling up my spine. He took a step toward the trunk, his grip tightening on the bat. I wanted to stop him, but my throat was too dry to speak. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the latch. The air seemed to grow colder with every second. The tapping had stopped again, but now I could hear something else, a faint, wheezing breath, like something was struggling to stay quiet inside. "Jake, don't," I finally managed to whisper, but it was too late. He unlatched the trunk and lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing at first. Just old, moth-eaten blankets. But as Jake dug deeper, pushing them aside, his face suddenly twisted in horror. "What the?" he started, but his voice was cut off by the sight inside the trunk. There, beneath the blankets, was a mirror. But not just any mirror, its surface was cracked, and something about it was wrong. Reflected in the cracked glass was not our reflection, but something else entirely. Two shadowy figures, their eyes gleaming unnaturally, stared back at us. Before I could react, a cold gust of wind blasted through the attic, knocking the trunk shut with a deafening bang. The light from Jake's phone flickered and went out, plunging us into pitch-black darkness. Then, the tapping started again, louder, faster, coming from all sides now. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. We scrambled for the stairs, our hearts pounding as the sound followed us, echoing from the very walls of the cabin. As we stumbled down the stairs, the air around us grew oppressive, almost suffocating. We bolted out the front door, slamming it shut behind us. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. The cabin loomed behind us, dark and foreboding, like a predator watching its prey flee. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and we sped down the dirt road without looking back. It wasn't until we were miles away that I dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but we're never going back there." As the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, a chill ran through me. I glanced down at my hands and froze. Across my palm, in faint, jagged letters, were the words, "I see you." I didn't tell Jake. Some things are better left unsaid. Second story. The stranger at the cabin door. I had been working overtime for months and desperately needed a break. So when I found a secluded cabin for rent deep in the Smoky Mountains, it felt perfect, just the kind of place to unplug and reset. The Airbnb listing made it sound idyllic, isolated, surrounded by miles of forest, with nothing but the sound of nature. I booked it without a second thought. The drive was long but peaceful. After winding through narrow roads, I finally reached the cabin. It was even more secluded than I'd expected, no other houses or cabins in sight, just thick trees all around and the occasional bird call. The owner had left the key in a lockbox, and as I stepped inside, I was welcomed by the scent of pine and the crackle of a fireplace waiting to be lit. I spent the first day hiking along some nearby trails. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with a light breeze that made the leaves rustle like whispers in the distance. As I walked through the dense woods, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. There wasn't a soul in sight. Just me and the mountains. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. I made myself a simple dinner and decided to sit out on the porch with a glass of wine. The view was stunning, endless trees stretching out as far as the eye could see, bathed in the soft orange light of the setting sun. It was easy to forget about the world here, to let go of stress and just exist. That's when I saw him. A figure moving through the trees, just beyond the clearing. He wasn't close, but I could see him well enough to know he was a man, wearing a dark jacket and a beanie. He wasn't walking quickly, just slowly weaving between the trees as though he had nowhere in particular to go. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was staying at a nearby cabin, even though I hadn't seen any others on my drive-in. Or maybe he was just a hiker, cutting through the woods to find a trail. But something about the way he moved unsettled me. He never looked up, never acknowledged the cabin. He just wandered. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen anyone all day, so of course my brain was going to latch onto the first person I spotted. I finished my wine and headed back inside as the sky grew darker. After a long day of hiking, I was looking forward to a relaxing night of Netflix and an early bedtime. About an hour into the movie, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. The doorbell? Who on earth would be here this late? The nearest town was miles away, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated for a moment, then got up slowly. I peeked through the small side window next to the door, and my stomach dropped. Standing on the porch was the man I had seen in the woods earlier. He was closer now, and his expression was off. He wasn't smiling, but there was a strange calmness about him that sent chills down my spine. "Can I help you?" I called out through the door, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man leaned closer, his face partially obscured by the dim porch light. "I'm lost," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Can you help me find my way back to my cabin?" I froze. Something about the way he said, "my cabin," felt wrong. Why would he be this far out if he had a cabin nearby? And why come here, of all places? My gut told me to lock the door and ignore him, but I didn't want to come across as rude. Maybe he really was lost. I don't know the area that well," I stammered, still keeping the door shut. "But I can call someone for you, or help you find directions." There was a long pause. He didn't move. Just stood there, breathing softly. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct told me that something was wrong. But after a few minutes passed and nothing else happened, I convinced myself it was over. He was just lost, probably embarrassed. He'd found his way back, and that would be the end of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window, the sun filtering through the trees. I had almost convinced myself that the previous night had been nothing, a weird coincidence that I had blown out of proportion. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I made myself some coffee and went out to the porch again, trying to enjoy the morning air. But as I sat there, sipping from my mug, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The man was back. He wasn't on the porch this time, but I could see him through the trees, standing in the exact same spot as before. He was staring at the cabin, motionless. Watching. For a moment, I wondered if I should wave, let him know I saw him, but I didn't. I just sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked deeper into the woods, disappearing from sight. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Tell them what? That some random man was walking in the woods near my cabin? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. But I couldn't ignore the growing fear gnawing at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I stayed inside, trying to keep myself busy, but every creak and groan of the old cabin made me jump. The sun set far too quickly, and soon the only light came from the flickering fireplace and the dull glow of the TV. I told myself it was fine, that the man was long gone. But deep down, I knew I didn't believe it. Then, just like the night before, the doorbell rang. I shot up from the couch, my body trembling. Slowly, I crept toward the door, peeking through the window. My heart nearly stopped. He was back. The man stood on the porch, closer this time, his face partially hidden by the shadows. His eyes gleamed in the faint light, and his lips curled into a small, unsettling smile. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I dialed 911, my voice barely audible as I told the operator there was a man outside my cabin. She asked if I was safe, if the doors were locked, and I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "Stay on the line," she said. "Help is on the way." I stayed in the corner of the room, clutching the phone, listening as the man knocked softly on the door. The minutes crawled by, each second more agonizing than the last. Finally, the knock stopped. I dared to peek through the window again, but he was gone. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I packed my bags that night and left the cabin as soon as the sun came up. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I think I see him, just out of the corner of my eye, standing in the shadows, watching. Waiting.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit the bell to catch all the new eerie horror stories. See you next time.